For 3 weeks, I watched my supervising teacher greet every student entering her classroom by name. That's no small achievement, as she had 240 students. She also knew the backstory of every child and would converse with them about sporting games, holidays, families, and so on. And this was not an accident. The school has a restorative philosophy based on Salesian teaching. The result is a classroom environment based on respect, care, and mutual responsibility. This was best seen in our daily house meetings, where the students from 4 different grades would gather for prayer, planning, and news. There was a collegial spirit as older students guided younger students. Now, to the layout of the art classroom, and this was carefully planned. The workbenches were arranged in a horseshoe where all the students could see each other, and the whiteboard area, which could be considered the teacher's home base. This gave her a view of the whole class, and she used this spot to impart information. I would consider my supervising teacher's demeanour, as described by Charles and Co., as being with it. She would move around the room, but always had a sense of what was happening everywhere. She never worked inside the horseshoe, as she demonstrated to me. As soon as you put your back to a student, you risk losing their engagement. A seating plan had been established at the start of the term based on individual student profiles. My supervising teacher was flexible, however, as student relationships changed or entangled, and she would allow variations depending on behaviour or specific tasks. I was told that rules and procedures were likewise established at the commencement of the year. These were enforced with a raised eyebrow and a direct look into the student's eyes. At times, behaviour would require more than a raised eyebrow to corral, and my teacher was naturally, or at least appeared naturally, to take control by being of an assertive disposition, and held her authority by establishing a culture of mutual respect, once again as discussed by Charles and Co. Summarising the positive learning environment in my placement, I have to agree with Hepburn and Beamish that the relationship between student learning and classroom management are inexplicably linked, where the design of the space, rules and procedures are clearly established and maintained, where lesson structures are regular in pattern, mutual respect is valued, all creating a theatre of learning that encourages the active participation of every student. During my PE, one realisation stood out. In a class of a shared age, there was a vast range of differences in the students in terms of physical growth and cognitive maturity, as well as a huge mix of social, racial, and cultural variances. When I considered this mixture in terms of Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of development, it was easy to see that the physical and cognitive differences stem from the biological makeup of the individual, which is at the centre of his model. However, as we track through the stages of micro, meso, exo to the macro system, it was evident the developmental influence on the students could come from a diverse number of sources. In my placement, for example, some students were new arrival in Australia following an extended refugee experience, with English being a second or third language, and their parents maybe having no English at all. While the school was a Catholic institution, approximately 40% of students identified as non-Christian, with a range of religions including Islam and Hinduism. While I agree with Bronfenbrenner's model that explains the influence on development, I find it frustrating that it identifies the influences on the developmental process, but doesn't offer any guidance in addressing any of the issues that these influences may impart on the student. Investigating Bronfenbrenner further to try and address this, I discovered that Bronfenbrenner himself kept refining his theories to the point he recognised that the world was changing so dramatically that in 2000 he co-wrote a paper with Gary Evans titled Development Science in the 21st Century, in which he admits that his work is primarily theoretical rather than applied. Others like Navarro and Tudge proposed in their neo-ecological theory that Bronfenbrenner needed updating to incorporate the social and cultural changes brought about the digital technologies revolution, such as online interactions and activities. How this relates to the classroom is a challenge, as Bronfenbrenner insisted on the importance of the relationship between parents and teachers and also the child's peers. Just before his death, Bronfenbrenner Bremer recognised the dichotomy of the public and private nature of social media, that with the changing world, a new or evolved theoretical response would be needed to incorporate all these new influences. In my PA, I watched as teachers and the school grappled with the incursion of social media on the students. There have been instances of online bullying, grooming, even sexting. Short of banning social media, these issues continue to present challenges to students, teachers, families, and the broader community. Bandura's social cognitive theory is an extension from the social learning theory as explained by Vygotsky. While they both embrace observational learning, Bandura emphasizes the cognitive role in the learning process. This is cognition overlaid onto the potential approaches of learning from three perspectives: behavioral, personal, and environmental. One of my first tasks during PE was to assist in a photographic excursion to the Botanic Gardens by a Year 9 and 10 Media Arts class. Their task was to explore the garden and create a coherent series of photographs that reflected a personal response. It would be easy to apply Vygotsky's social constructive theory, where learning occurs through the social interaction and help of others. However, the response of the learning task of the group of 30 students was varied. Some held back and carefully considered the action of others before mimicking them in subject choice and photographic response. Pure Vygotsky. Some brought already formed ideas of what they were going to attempt and enforced their ideas onto the situation. The result of these was most disappointing, as they failed to see what was on offer. Another grouping of students seemed lost as to where and how they should start. It was this group that I think I achieved the best results of the day. Following the suggestion of taking a single photograph, they were then challenged to repeat and expand on this first image. How could they improve it? Are there other similar possibilities nearby? What if they did the opposite? All questions that set them thinking. Within a short time they were mixing observational learning, stimulated by the environment, but driven by a cognitive approach. This was Bandura in action. Was this relevant to the learning experience? Bandura certainly wasn't in front of mine while I was stimulating thoughts and giving feedback to students. My directions are rather intuitive and made in response to the situation and the impasse. In reflection, I do question the remoteness of theoretical knowledge as to being on the ground. Then again, had I learnt something in my own classroom in the day's teaching that wasn't as intuitive as I originally thought, but rather a subliminal remembered response from my own learnings? The constructivist approach to development and learning is complex and varied. It's a conceptual umbrella that shelters a range of theorists where all ideas seem to have stemmed from either Vygotsky or Piaget. Constructivism has engendered a considerable range of approaches to teaching and learning. What I learnt in my PE was the organic nature of learning, and to say this is right and that is wrong is to misunderstand the application of theory as a part of a teacher's arsenal. A good example of this fluidity was a double lesson I planned and took with a class of Year 8 students. The first hour was to be the continuation of a pencil portrait using the grid system. The class had already worked on their drawings for 3 weeks and were not particularly engaged. After discussion with my supervisor, I constructed a second lesson anchored on the work of abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock. Following an introduction to his work, the class would experiment with paint through dipping, throwing, splashing and smudging to create pictures that vibrated with form and colour. The lesson was structured simply as a I do, we do, you do, with a huge emphasis on experimentation. The only guidance was to try and maintain the vibrancy of the coloured paint and not allow it to go muddy. After watching me model ways of applying paint, the class couldn't wait to get into it. They stepped through the 6 features of a cognitive apprenticeship and seemed to appreciate that I continued to paint alongside them. As Margate, Woolfolk and Usher outlined, I intuitively gave students clues and guidance, encouragement, as well as continual modelling. While this can be seen as reciprocal teaching, the reciprocity was also provided by their peers. It made me aware that Vygotsky, the constructionist, was intuitively allowing me to apply this social cultural theory to the development. However, as the students' confidence grew, the role of experimentation became central to their activity. While they were still conversing and observing, they had also entered a cerebral state where they were journeying independently through exploration and discovery. To me, it finally felt like Vygotsky and Piaget had come to an understanding that the learning process was not a tight theoretical consideration, rather the students maintained a fluid journey between the internal and the external. The visual art classroom is a special place for students. The ambience is usually more casual than elsewhere in the school, and the activities, about 80% of learning time, are fun and messy and generally encourage experimentation and exploration. Subsequently, the class motivation is usually higher. If you consider motivation against Maslow's hierarchy of needs, every student entering the space has moved well beyond the basic deficiency needs he defines, such as food and security and shelter. They're now in the being needs of his hierarchy, where creativity and accomplishment are on offer. To take this further, I felt in my PE observations that the socio-cultural conceptions of motivation were a strong driver in the momentum of the studio. The teacher has created a club-like ambience where all the students were members. This was enhanced by working in the round where they all could easily observe each other as they worked. They were encouraged to converse, and at times music, selected by the students themselves, was played. They were also encouraged to critique others' work in progress. I observed continual encouragement and comment, always positive. This sense of belonging was further enhanced by the exhibition of classwork at the end of each project in public areas of the school. There was a private and collective pride as students investigated their own and class work in such a positive display. Students from outside the group were also attracted to the display, which in turn enhanced the prestige of those in the class and their subsequent motivation. My supervising teacher was a great lesson planner. She brought together her version of Epstein and Ames's target model, overlaid with a simple cycle of self-regulated learning. She used this to establish a step structure and template for the lesson. This structural plan was introduced at the start of each lesson and supplied to each student. One variation she added to this was establishing the goal as part of the outlining the task. Once again, these goals were tailored to individuals within the group, documented and were based on her knowledge of student abilities and a considered expectation of what they could achieve in the session. At times she would engage with individuals to establish achievable goals which can be considered mastery goals as identified by Roland. But perhaps her greatest investment in class motivation was a mastery of target's final element, time. All lessons were broken into short time expectations for the class as a whole, and then overlaid with the needs of some of the students within the group whose concentration, or lack of it, could have impact on the momentum of the group. This including asking students with ADD to change the paint water containers for the whole class, or at times suggest they may need a bathroom break. This proactive approach to scheduling allowed for the variation in the class's abilities and contributed to the shared and individual motivation.